Hi folks. I really hope this is going to be my last set of videos on this topic, but I did want to do a little update now that grade appeals are underway. If you're unfamiliar with the State of the Union for IB grades for May 2020, check out my first video, the link's in the description. In this video, we'll be looking a little bit at appeals and also what they might tell us about the initial grade assignment. Before we get into it, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to come down on people who did well on the initial grade assignment this year. Many students got grades that were appropriate or close enough to appropriate that they didn't preclude their post-secondary plans. And honestly, if I got a decent result, I might be a bit annoyed or at the very least dismissive if somebody was out there saying that not all of these grades were fair and reliable across the board. As a teacher, if I didn't know students and other teachers who were impacted by this, I probably wouldn't have gone to the trouble of making these videos. So if you got a good grade, be justifiably proud. That's great. I'm just saying that there are also other people who deserve to do better than they were treated by this algorithm. I've said it before, but I'll reiterate that making a process that is fair on average is very different from making one that is fair and reliable for each individual. I'll do a part 2 of this video to deal with some other cases, but for now let's take a look at the example that we've been using in all the videos. So here's a student who's predicted at a 4, gets a moderated IA grade of 5, and receives a 2, along with the word that the grade is fair and reliable on July 5th, 2020. I don't think there are many students who could see that result and think, okay, that makes sense. I mean, I don't know, maybe it does make sense, but I'd want to know the basis on which someone judges that. So the IB has a special appeals process this year where schools can have grades revisited on an individual, subject, or whole cohort basis. After revisiting the score we just mentioned, the grade was amended to a 5. And I'm happy that the IB is doing this appeals process, and I want to thank them for pursuing this. But it does once again call into question how the initial grades were generated in the first place. In particular, one might ask, what exactly are these appeals based on? So here's how it works. If a school appeals on a subject basis, then they have to submit class averages for predicted grades, moderated IAs, and final grades for 2018, 2019, and 2020. That's it. And this is all outlined in a TES.com article that I'll link in the video description. Now, presumably someone or some function looks at those averages and determines whether or not the grade should be revisited. And at first glance, that looks like a great double check. But at the same time, it requires some wild cognitive dissonance. On one hand, you're to believe that an algorithm has been used that is so sophisticated that it can use the IB's, quote, vast historical data, their words, not mine, to amend hundreds of thousands of predicted grades in a way that is reliable down to a person-by-person level for 170,000 people. That sounds pretty advanced to me. On the other hand, the algorithm is not so sophisticated that it can figure out whether 2018 and 2019 class averages are similar. It needs humans to email that info in a couple of weeks after grades are assigned, and in a lot of cases, weeks after students have been cut from their preferred post-secondary plans. The cognitive dissonance required here has literally been ruining my sleep for the past month or so. Since the IB hasn't released their algorithm, I think there are a couple of things that one might reasonably infer from this. The first is that those initial grades were not all fair and reliable, since apparently a different method can be used to produce different equally fair and reliable grades for the exact same student using the exact same prediction and the exact same IA mark. The second inference is less of a sure thing and more just my personal experience, but when the IB uses the term vast historical data, I think there's a good chance that it's just a euphemism for 2019 results, at least for some courses. If the basis for reassessing the grades is to provide the 2018 results, then it seems unlikely that they figured in the initial calculation. Either that or the 2019 results were just weighted very heavily. I can say that the initial mark assignment in my course looked a lot more like the 2019 results than the 2018 results. Now, ideally, the IB would just explain what they mean by vast historical data, but they have yet to do that. Now, I get that I'll probably be criticized for being too harsh on this process, since it's basically an impossible task with unverifiable results. In my first video on the topic, I make basically that point. The appeals process is clearly trying to right some of the wrongs in the initial grade assignment. I should probably just say thank you, and maybe I look like a malcontent by continuing to raise issues with the initial process. But I think there still are 3 important points to make. Number 1, the messaging. Setting aside the difficulty of the task of generating these grades, it's hard not to take issue with the messaging in early July around how these grades were fair and reliable. We just saw an example of a grade that changed by 3 after appeals. But by then, universities have already made scholarship and admissions decisions because they got word that these grades were all fair. The appeals process deals with this a bit, but in a lot of cases, the damage is already done. Number 2, evidence of accuracy. Let's consider the unverifiable nature of these final grades. We will never know how each individual in the 2020 cohort might score on their exams, which, ironically, is both a criticism and a defense of these grades. But there are simple ways to determine how reliably this process predicts grades. Since they have all the data in their algorithm, the IB has a vast statistical playground. They could use their algorithm to take the 2018 results and predict the 2019 results, and then publish how often it gave the correct grade. But not the mean, for all manner of sins of individual grade assignment may be hidden in the mean, but the proportion of time it was correct in assigning grades. That way the public could have an idea of just how reliable the model is. Number 3, transparency. I think this is the most important point. This process needs to be shared with and vetted by some university statistics departments. I'll be the first to admit that maybe I wouldn't understand the intricacies of the process. But that doesn't mean that it should stay behind closed doors or that external organizations shouldn't scrutinize it. And I don't mean vague statements about robust statistical models and vast historical data. I mean the actual process. Beyond the effect that this has had on some students this year, there are huge theory of knowledge questions that arise from this process. Essentially, the word from the IB is that students should believe that these are reasonable grades because the IB says they are. That even though mathematical techniques were used to generate these values, students should take it on faith that the results are correct, as opposed to on analysis and reason. And that's really anathema to what mathematics is all about. If someone is going to tell me that they can predict the future using mathematics and some pretty thin data, then I want to know how, and with what degree of accuracy, and with how much confidence. I'm really worried about what it means if people accept numerical results as dogma rather than the results of analysis and proof. Because we said so is never a high enough bar for an explanation in mathematics. It requires transparency and communication. Mathematics is not just a cult of numbers, and it makes me very nervous that this process was able to be sold so easily to so many without an explanation of how it works, or even really that it works. I feel that if I accept this process without explanation, then I'm saying that there's no need for people to actually perform music or compete in sports or hold elections. That performance in general can be accurately predicted through whatever method was used to generate the 2020 IB grades. And if that's the case, then let it be on some kind of evidence rather than faith. But if this process gets endorsed as acceptable without some serious scrutiny, then we should all be nervous about what it means for the future of grading practices. And of course, AI has a place in education. But if it's going to involve stakes this big, then it shouldn't be too much to ask to demonstrate its accuracy. For everyone out there giving the IB and off-qual the benefit of the doubt on this process, allow me to quote the infinite wisdom of Wanda the Owl from BoJack Horseman. You know, it's funny. When you look at someone with rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look like flags. So as the Wired article about the 2020 IB results notes, there were some red flags in this process. And the existence of appeals based on previous school results is a tacit acknowledgement that, despite the word going out to universities, not all of those initial grades were fair and reliable. As a reasonable counterpoint, it might be only 10% or so of students who are significantly mistreated by this algorithm. So it's tempting to say, well, isn't getting it right-ish, or reasonable at least, 90% of the time, good enough? That's the question that we'll deal with in part 2 of this video, along with a few interesting case studies.